Hi there. If you missed our instruction last week, we covered the Cold War and a little bit of the civil rights movement, particularly the early years. Now, you will get a lot more of both of these eras of American history in high school, but it's important to understand this for a couple of reasons. One, World War II doesn't just end and everything go back to normal. There is a sea change in how dispossessed Americans, women, minorities, see what they want for their futures. And even though we are also going to cover the human rights era and the idea of universal human rights, that doesn't really fit if I don't talk about how World War II led to a lot of this. Now, of course, we talk about the Cold War. It's not a hot war because if the US and the Soviet Union had gone to war, it would have ended in nuclear weapons, certainly after 1949 when the Soviets had essentially stolen the technology from us. So instead, we fight this war with weaker allied countries. The Chinese Revolution is going to massively complicate that. In 1949, the Chinese have defeated the Republicans, and the Republicans then move off to the island of Formosa, now called Taiwan. If you missed class, I'm telling you, go online, go on YouTube, look up John Cena Apology Taiwan. It'll blow your mind. But this is going to cause more fear that communism is spreading throughout the world. Now, let's talk about the differences, and our friend Drake here is going to help us with this. If you think of the American system, particularly for economics, the American system is capitalism. My Little Pony. People own something. An individual has property. Versus communism. Under communism, the government, or the goal is the people, own and control all of the means of production. So it's not My Little Pony, it's Our Little Pony. So Americans would say communists were socialist tyrants. They didn't give their individual citizens a choice in government. Property rights were banned, while communists would say Americans were greedy, capitalist tyrants. They point to the segregation that was legally enforced in our country, the focus of owning property and greed. Take a second, you might want to pause that. Long story short, government versus private individuals and the control of the economy. So if you think of the world as East versus West, this is looking at it from the very top of the North Pole. The Western side, which was the US and our allies, particularly along Western Europe, are going to face off against Eastern Europe, which had been under the control of the Soviet sphere of communism, the Soviet Union, China, and some of other nations that were starting to see communism spread, such as North Vietnam, North Korea. So it really is East versus West. Now, one of the things that really made Americans paranoid about the Soviet Union was the secrecy. There was a lack of communication from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And what you would see is Prime Minister Winston Churchill, by then no longer Prime Minister, had warned Americans in the world that an iron curtain had descended across Europe in order to prevent world peace. So what we had learned from World War II is it's good to have allies. The U.S. helps form and is the leading member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Those are the countries that were the founding members. It has spread and increased its numbers since 1949 when it was founded. The Soviet Union had conquered Eastern Europe from the Germans, particularly, the Hitler-run Nazi regime. And they just never let it go. So the Soviets made sure to take those satellite states that they had firm control over and make them quote-unquote allies. We call that the Warsaw Pact. Truman sees the spread of communism, and it's not generally willingly spread. As I said, Eastern Europe had been dominated by the Soviet military, and so he issues the Truman Doctrine. We call it containment. That the U.S. would support any actions that prevents communism from spreading. If a nation suddenly tries to become communist, we would actively stop it. If there is a current communist nation, we're going to try to surround it with pro-American, anti-communist nations. This is going to result in a couple of things. The space race. As you can see the picture on the bottom right, is of the world's first satellite, Sputnik. And from there, you would see more powerful rockets develop. Now, it's not because of science, it's because of the second race, the arms race. If you can use a rocket to deliver a payload of, I don't know, a nuclear weapon into space, and that can then be dropped on your enemy, it's incredibly effective. It's nearly impossible, particularly in 1950s and 60s. It would be impossible to intercept and stop that. But this arms race is going to lead so many things like the space race in the battle for technology so that you can have some superiority, not only in the number, but the power of those weapons. Now, because both sides were so afraid of the other one using their nuclear advantage, they kept making more and more weapons. And the number of weapons is obscene, how much is made during the Cold War era. Just to give you sort of a perspective, we're looking at about 5,000 warheads today that the U.S. has, about 5,000 warheads that the Russians have. That's today after the reduction in a lot of the weapons. And the size of the weapons increases. If you pause this image for just a second, you'll be able to see that on the far right are the tiny little fission devices that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As you continue to move to the left, you're seeing the capability, or at least the potential, of a lot of our nuclear weapons. Now, South Korea had been an ally of the U.S. ever since the end of World War II. Not a great government, but one day the North Koreans decide, through a little mess up of our Secretary of State, who was talking about all the hotspots that the U.S. was focused on. Well, North Korea decides, oh, no one's really looking at South Korea. Let's put the country back together again. So they launch a massive invasion. The U.S. enters the war. They push communist forces back. After 3 years of this, after bloody stalemate, 35,000 Americans were killed. Tens of thousands of NATO and UN and Soviet allied citizens were also killed. The Chinese lost hundreds of thousands. That doesn't even include the South and North Koreans fighting. Because of this slaughter, what happens is there's an armistice, a timeout, which means technically that UN action is still in effect today. Now, the Soviets are just like the Americans. They're wanting to prevent their opponent, us, from spreading. So the Soviet Union, once they see the Cuban Revolution succeed in 1959, they very quickly connect up with Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro turns Cuba into a communist nation. So much for containment. In 1961, brand new President Kennedy sort of messes up by listening to the CIA, tries to fund and support a group of Cuban liberators to take back the island. That blows up in his face. But the Soviets take that as a message. They realize that if they don't place nuclear weapons in Cuba, the U.S. will continue to try to attack. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasts for about 13 days. At the end of it, the Soviets agree to take out the weapons. There's a lot more to it, but that's just the brief version. Let me get past this. Okay. Now, what the heck does this have to do with civil rights? They seem like two completely disconnected things. They're not. The Soviets throughout the Cold War continually point at the failings of American democracy and American society, particularly segregation. We had laws that legally separated whites and others, African Americans in particular, and it used a pretty severe police state in order to keep control over African Americans. Because of World War II and all of its promises on equality and freedom and opportunity, once the war ended, a lot of groups, from women to African Americans, were no longer willing to go back to the way things were. And you begin to see, particularly with African Americans, the resulting use of civil disobedience, which is a lot of violence against African Americans who refuse to obey government orders. They wouldn't be violent, but they refuse to obey. And the media is going to play a big part in this success. One of the more famous ones is the Montgomery bus boycott. Hopefully you all recognize Rosa Parks. In 1955, she refused to give up a seat. This is going to immediately lead to a young 26-year-old minister who just came into Montgomery to lead the boycott effort. His name, of course, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who would become the symbol of the civil rights movement. After a year of that boycott where African Americans refused to buy tickets, financial pressure, court actions caused Montgomery to drop its segregated bus system. Brown versus Board of Education, that's Linda Brown, cute little girl. In 1951, her father feels it's inappropriate that she has to go across town to the black school when there's a white school a couple blocks away. Of course he's right. Because of the dangers involved in her walking to that African American school, the courts say a couple of things. One, Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, created in the 14th Amendment, was being violated. There is no equality. It is not equal, it is separate. Therefore, the policy was unconstitutional and illegal. And this is going to start the process of getting public institutions desegregated. This is the watershed moment of the civil rights movement. From this point on, the civil rights movement seems really for historians and political scientists to be unavoidable. Now, schools are required to desegregate, yes, in some public institutions, but civil rights groups decide to go after non-government organizations and companies. You can see on the top left picture, you've got one African-American woman and two white people who are sitting at a counter, a lunch counter, which would have been illegal and immoral for many segregationists in the South. They would stage sit-ins where they would simply refuse to leave. They would not fight back. They used a lot of peaceful protests and, in fact, learned some of these nonviolent protests, originally, I don't want to say pioneered by Gandhi, but particularly used effectively by Gandhi. Dr. King and others are going to embrace that model and make sure the media is there at all times. Now, in the South, white reaction to these desegregation efforts were often violent. Many African Americans and even whites were arrested, beaten, lynched, and police and other authorities seemed to do nothing. I skipped through that because if you are interested in finding out what the heck that previous image was, and you have a strong enough stomach, you might want to take a look at Emmett Till, T-I-L-L. It is a very disturbing story about a 14-year-old African American in Mississippi that apparently said the wrong thing to the wrong people. And the fact that what he said was considered wrong, pretty disturbing. Under President Johnson, who would replace Kennedy, the civil rights movement gained a lot of federal support. The FBI comes in. You're beginning to see enforcement of state and local voting rights by the federal government. The civil rights movement is successful because of the violent reaction of whites that's captured and viewed, broadcast by TV, by newspapers, to the nation, to the world. And while people are looking at the non-violent protests and seeing all of this violence, it is truly disturbing to those who would very quickly begin to turn against segregationism. And although we're going to see a lot of growth in the 1960s and 70s with civil rights, when we get to our human rights unit, we still have a little bit to go. So if you have not gotten that down in your notes, please take time to do that. If you have questions, please let me know. There's a lot of great stuff that is available online. If you're looking for additional content, let me know. Thank you.